You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, hello and welcome. I am Ross Tokola of the East-West Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on European-DPRK Track 2 engagement, facilitating dialogue and diplomacy. This North Korea in the World webinar is the second in a series examining North Korea's historical and contemporary relations with countries in Europe, including in the context of North Korean and European countries' relations with South Korea, with the United States, and with others in the Indo-Pacific region. The North Korea in the World project is a joint initiative of the National Committee on North Korea and the East-West Center in Washington. The NorthKoreaInTheWorld.org website collects and curates information and data on North Korea's external economic and diplomatic relations. Our program today will be moderated by Esther Im, who is a program manager at the National Committee on North Korea. Previously, Esther was a junior Fulbright researcher in South Korea and a researcher at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations, where she covered sanctions, nonproliferation, and disarmament issues during South Korea's second term on the Security Council. She has interned at the U.S.-Korea Institute at SAIS, at the Wilson Center, and at the Council on Foreign Relations. Esther has a Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations and Political Science from Wellesley College. With that, and on behalf of the East-West Center, I thank you for tuning in to today's program, and I turn our program over to Esther Im of the National Committee on North Korea.
Thanks, Ross, for that welcome and that introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Esther. I'm really pleased to be moderating this session today. We're excited to have Mr. Glen Ford with us. And as Ross mentioned, and as our invitation suggested, we're going to be talking about European Track 2 engagement with North Korea. European Track 2 engagement has played an important part in facilitating dialogue with North Korea, especially during difficult periods of official diplomacy. And European countries such as Sweden, Norway, and Finland have notably taken a lead in investing in these efforts, which have helped to create space and flexibility to discuss sensitive issues, as well as a host of other organizations, European organizations. And I just wanted to do a little bit of background for those who may be unfamiliar with the term Track 2. Track 2 diplomacy typically refers to unofficial meetings between non-governmental representatives of usually adversarial groups or nations to discuss ways to resolve conflict and misunderstanding. Track 2 participants are usually or often former government officials or well-regarded experts. But in the case of North Korea, representatives at Track 2 meetings are usually government officials. And so the term Track 2 usually refers to meetings, the meeting's unofficial nature and the composition of US or third country delegations rather than the North Korean side. So just wanted to, there's a lot of nuances in that, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit, but I just wanted, the importance of these Track 2 meetings is their kind of informal nature, and it gives participants greater freedom to address sensitive issues or kind of discuss unorthodox ideas that may be difficult to do in a more formal situation. And so we'd like to unpack the value and even some of the challenges of these kind of meetings with Mr. Glen Ford, who is a trailblazer and a veteran of these kind of meetings. And so I'll briefly introduce him to you, and then we'll get into a discussion with Mr. Ford. Glen Ford is the founder and director of Track 2 Asia, which is a nonprofit organization based in Brussels that engages in Track 2 activities with North Korea and other East Asia countries. Prior to this, he served over 25 years in the European Parliament, which is the legislative body of the EU. He was elected in 1989, and during his tenure, he has been a member of the Delegation for Relations with Japan, rapporteur on the EU-Korea Science Technology Agreement, rapporteur on the EU-ASEAN FTA, and he was appointed by the Council of Ministers as the EU's chief election observer in Indonesia and Aceh. He first traveled to North Korea in 1997 and has since made almost 50 visits to the country since that trip. He is also an author of several books on North Korea, including North Korea on the Brink and Talking to North Korea, which I have here. So if you're interested in learning more about Glyn's experiences and his insights, definitely encourage you to pick one of those up. So without further ado, you can read his full bio on our website, but I'd like to now turn to Mr. Glen Ford to provide some opening remarks.
Okay, I mean, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I've been engaged with North Korea for a very long time now. I was responsible in the European Parliament back in the 1980s for a report being done by the International Trade Committee on EU-North Korea trade. And the answer was there wasn't any. Things have really not changed. The result of that is the North Koreans knew who I was in their embassy in Paris. It's an embassy to UNESCO, not to the French government. The French government still doesn't have diplomatic relations with North Korea. The result of that was that during the famine in the late 1990s, I had a visit into my office in the European Parliament by 2 North Koreans. The reason they came to see me was at the time, European Commission officials were not allowed to talk to North Koreans, and there were no diplomatic relations effectively between North Korea and the EU. 1 or 2 member states, I think it was Denmark, Portugal, and Sweden had diplomatic relations, but nobody else. So they came to see me about food aid, and basically I said to them, well, I need to see what the situation is on the ground if you're going to ask me to make a case for providing food aid. The result of which was my first visit to North Korea when I took 2 fellow MEPs on an unofficial visit to North Korea. And we were there in 97. We were actually there. We left the day that Kim Jong-il officially took over as leader of North Korea. There was a 3-year mourning period, so know exactly when we were there. I am a scientist, but not a medical scientist. What we could see in North Korea was that there were people in need. We visited children's centres, orphanages, out some of the villages and the rest where there'd been flood damage and everything else. It was very clear that there was a need for assistance. And I said to them, would they like an official delegation from the European Parliament? And they said yes. And I said, we don't care how I get it, do you? And they said no. So when we came back, we tabled a very critical resolution demanding access to North Korea for an official delegation from the Parliament to investigate the stories about severe malnutrition and a famine. And much to everybody's surprise, apart from mine, the response from the Koreans to this hard-hitting resolution was to say, send a delegation. So I then went back for the second time. We had 3 ad hoc delegations. Jacques Santer, the former Commission President, was on 2 of them. We had a Belgian Prime Minister on another, and we had those delegations. And in 2004, we actually converted the ad hoc delegations into a standing delegation with the Korean Peninsula. So the European Parliament has a standing delegation for relations with South and North Korea. And that delegation still exists today. It's there. I traveled to North Korea on many occasions. I went with the Friedrich Neumann Foundation on 2 occasions. I went with the Socialist Group and whatever. And I was traveling probably at least yearly to North Korea on some pretext or another. In 2010, I should say that partly because we're politicians, as opposed to sort of government officials, we tended to deal with the party, the Workers' Party of Korea, and the Supreme People's Assembly, the North Korean Parliament, rather than the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's unusual but that's the case. In 2010, I was approached by the party to ask if I could establish a political dialogue between the European Union and North Korea. The reality was that wasn't going to happen at an official level. But what I proposed was that we use some senior former European politicians in Europe to have such a dialogue with the head of the international department of the party. Those included Jonathan Powell, who's still engaged in the process, Tony Blair's former chef de cabinet, myself, and we had former ministers from Sweden, from Switzerland, from Germany, and from France on various occasions participating in this. And we've had an ongoing track 1.5 dialogue with the international department of the party from 2010 till 2018. First, it was Kim Jong-il, apparently an uncle of Kim Jong-il. Then it was Kang Suk-ju, who'd been the chief negotiator in the six-party talks. Then briefly Chae Tae-bok when Kang Suk-ju was ill, and more recently Ri So-young. They're all Politburo members. And in fact, Ri So-young was on the executive of the Politburo, one of the 8 most important people in North Korea, and effectively, their international spokesman. It's difficult to explain sometimes to people, but in places like China, Vietnam, North Korea, the party is more important than the ministry. For example, Ri So-young was foreign minister and was then promoted to international secretary of the party. It's nothing to do with our merits, I would emphasize, but we're lucky in that regard because most other Track 2 groups, if you're American, it's the American Studies Institute that you talk to, which is a subset of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If you are American or non-American, it's the Institute for Disarmament and Peace, which is also a subset of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that are the, if you want, the political Track 2 meetings. So that's where they go. As far as I know, we're unique in actually having this dialogue with the party. We generally were going twice yearly. The intention originally was to alternate, but frankly, the visa regulations and the rest mean that though we've had probably close to 20 meetings, probably more like 17 or 18, I haven't counted them, they've only come here once when Kang Suk-ju came to Berlin, Brussels, and Bern in 2014. Interestingly, the Japanese foreign minister at the time, Kishida, shared our hotel in Berlin. And the North Koreans looked very tired the following morning. I suspect something else may have been going on at the same time, as there was a statement about shortly afterwards about the abductee issue and the rest. In terms of, and I'll try and bring this to a close reasonably quickly, in terms of other Track 2 dialogues, I mean, Ken Hartstead in Sweden, who is a special representative on North Korea now, but also Singapore ambassador, has been doing some fairly solid work and is well known for that. And I've traveled with him to North Korea in the past. I'm certainly aware that the Pugwash Institute in The Hague has been doing work with the Institute for Disarmament and Peace. And strangely, there's a Cambodian group who's been bringing Europeans and North Koreans together in Siem Reap. But one has to distinguish between kind of ongoing relationships and one-off visits. There's a lot of people who've been to North Korea on an occasion, but there's probably from Europe only 4 or 5 groups that have a regular meeting, because like anywhere in Asia, actually having some continuity is a good thing. I've now been going for close to 25 years. So I've seen people, or I've seen some of the people I deal with having children, getting them into the Kim Il-sung University and worrying about where they're going to go from here. So, I mean, that certainly helps in terms of the dialogue. I'll probably leave it at that for the moment and deal with some of your questions and the rest.
Thanks so much, Glenn, for that overview. And for our audience tuning in, we'll have about a moderated discussion for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So definitely put your questions into the Q&A box if you have them, and we'll pose them to Glenn. So Glenn, thanks so much for that again. And I kind of want to pick up where you left off about continuity. Europe strikes me as a country who, as a continent that kind of benefits from, having diplomatic relations, many countries, almost all countries having diplomatic relations with North Korea, some even having embassies in the country, which I think adds to the ability to have this kind of continuity and dialogue. So I want to ask you kind of to unpack that a little bit. Why has that continuity of these track 2 dialogues been so beneficial? Is it the kind of relationship building? Is it the ability to have long discussions over time and kind of compare the evolution of ideas? If you could speak to a little bit about some of the opportunities and challenges of track 2 dialogue specifically, appreciate your input.
I mean, the advantage we have is that we're neither Americans or South Koreans. I have to say, I mean, people have been saying recently that North Korea is not talking to anybody. That's not true. North Korea is not talking to Americans and South Koreans. They've been offering to talk to Europeans on at least 3 occasions over the last couple of years. More recently, back in November, there was a request to reopen the political dialogue that the European Union has with North Korea. The problem's been that in the current circumstances, the European Union has been rather nervous. And so those approaches have not been taken up. But the idea that North Korea aren't prepared to talk to anybody is not the case. They are, at least at European level. And I'm hoping maybe with Macron's re-election in France that may change. I mean, the European Union has diplomatic relations with North Korea. Those were established in 2001 when a troika of Javier Solana, who was the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, but also chair of the European Council, Goran Pearson, Javier Solana, the High Representative, Chris Patton, the External Affairs Commissioner, actually went to North Korea on a visit, and they established diplomatic relations and the human rights dialogue. In 2001, the human rights dialogue was established between the EU and North Korea. And in fact, that was suspended a couple of years later. But North Koreans did offer to reopen that human rights dialogue in 2014, and the European Union refused. So there is some kind of engagement there. 26 of the 27 member states of the EU have diplomatic relations. The situation with Estonia is a bit vague, because there's a dispute where they are with those, but they had relations at one point. The other 25 certainly do. The only one who doesn't is France. And that's been consistent and is a Estonian issue of, if you want, trying to improve EU relations, but nevertheless, that's the case.
Great. And then if I could just, push you a little bit to talk about your track 2 dialogues and your reflections over 25 years of these kinds of dialogues. What do you think have been the opportunities and the challenges? Well,
I mean, in terms of the track 2 dialogues, as opposed to me meeting North Koreans, that's only been going for 10. So we've had a relationship, but it's not been the same group of people meeting the same group of people necessarily. So, I mean, the track 2 is probably is 10 years old. And let me say that the North Koreans are still interested in continuing that dialogue. And, we have discussions about possible visits. It may be because COVID has finally arrived in North Korea that those visits will be sooner rather than later. I still don't anticipate it being before the end of the year, but obviously, the zero COVID policy for North Korea, has now been overtaken by events. So that makes it easier for a future visit to take place. So that's where we are there. And what we've achieved, well, what the difficulties are that the North Koreans are happy to talk about anything. I mean, politely, in terms of our dialogue, and because we're at a sufficiently high level, I mean, we don't have the speeches read out as you sometimes do at some other levels. So it's a reasonably frank exchange of views. But I mean, they've got a strong position. Partly because of the level we operate at. There's been a fair amount of interest in our work in South Korea, Japan, and the United States, as well as the European Union. So it's given us fairly easy access on occasion to the Blue House, to the Cabinet Office in Japan, to the ministries. We've certainly met with the State Department on a number of occasions, and in the White House a couple of times. So I mean, that's given us that access to try and pass on the messages. I mean, we're not given official messages. There's no one saying this is the message we want you to take. But we're very open with the North Koreans of who we're going to speak to after, where we're going. We don't keep that a secret in any way, so they know who we're going to give a summary of what we think they're telling us.
Would you be willing to share perhaps an anecdote from some of your Track 2 experiences of how you've been able to take some of these conversations and analyze them for, as you say, the North
Well,
Korean.
my favorite is it was almost a Kurt Vonnegut moment of the Sirens of Titan, but for those who know it, but I won't go into that. I mean, we traveled to North Korea in November 2017. About November the 20th, which was about 10 days before the ICBM launch. And Ri So-young said to us at the time that Trump's going to be furious with what we do next. We wondered what it was, and it was an ICBM launch. And we traveled again in January 2018, I think it was 31st, and we met with Ri So-young. And obviously that was when there was lots of talk about Fire and Fury and Bloody Noses and the rest. And Ri So-young said to us that, look, if the Americans think we're going to sit and wait for them to attack us, they've got to be joking. There will be a point at which we will preemptively strike, because we know what happened in Iraq. I mean, and so I said, well, what's an example of that? We said evacuation of non-combatants. Fine. We were in the White House a few days later, and that was mentioned in passing to McMaster. Nothing was said at the time. Fine. I then got a copy of Bob Woodward's book, Fear, and there in Fear is somebody who'd met with Ri So-young, told McMaster the evacuation of non-combatants would start a war, and he ran upstairs to stop Trump tweeting that he was going to evacuate non-combatants. So that's probably as good as it gets.
That's incredible. Well, I'm glad that you were able to pass along that message, and
Well,
perhaps
we're having a conversation. Somebody picked it up. That's the interesting thing. It was not, this is a message. It was almost a throwaway comment at the White House.
Yeah. I'd like to pivot a little bit and get your insight a little bit about, I've mentioned Finland, Sweden, Norway have been European countries that have invested and organized a lot of these Track 2 dialogues. And I'd love to get your opinion a little bit about kind of what drives these countries to promote these kind of dialogues, and what role can these countries play in ensuring that these Track 2 dialogues continue in the face of the lack of the Track 2.
I mean, the Swedes, for example, have always taken the stance that they will have a dialogue. Well, they want to have relations with everybody, not necessarily because they like them, but they think it's important to be able to have a dialogue. The same is largely true of the Swiss. I haven't dealt with the Swiss very much because they're not part of the European Union. I always, if you want, doing it from a European Union point of view. But I mean, both of those countries and the Scandinavian countries generally have that kind of approach. It's better to talk than not to talk. And the Swedes have been on the ground in Pyongyang since, I don't know exactly when, but certainly since the 80s, if not earlier. And until 2001, when the British established diplomatic relations and the EU did, I mean, we used the Swedish embassy on our visits. Even there was not a single Swede as part of our delegation. And they have acted on behalf of the United States on occasion with some of the people who've been detained in North Korea by Pyongyang. So yes, I mean, that served a useful purpose. I actually think it helps. At the moment, unfortunately, there are no European diplomats left in Pyongyang because, understandably, the lockdown in Pyongyang has been extremely fierce. And they really haven't been able to do much, and they've all rotated out, and no one's been allowed to rotate back in. But I mean, I know it's the intention for the people I talk to in Sweden and, for that matter, the United Kingdom, that they're keen to send their diplomats back as soon as it's possible. So we want to continue that diplomatic relationship. Doesn't mean to say that either of those countries agree with what North Korea is doing, but I do think it's important to talk about it.
Thank you. I want to open up the Q&A shortly, so I'll just ask kind of one final question, and I guess, try to combine these two questions. First, kind of, you mentioned briefly the North Koreans wanting to engage in these dialogues, and I'd be curious if you could share a little bit about your perspective of how they engage in these track 2 dialogues differently from official dialogues, and whether you feel like they use these strategically. And then second, kind of as a final review, what would be your wish list moving forward for the kind of prospect of track 2s, especially at this current juncture?
I mean, from a North Korean point of view, they certainly saw the European Union as a potentially different global pole from the United States. They're not naive, and we certainly tell them that our interests are very similar to those of the United States. And so don't expect any clear blue water between us, but they're not identical. So yes, I mean, the European Union actually had a North Korea strategy document it produced in around 2001, a country paper about critical engagement with North Korea, and that's still officially the European Union policy. But I guess at the moment there's more criticism than engagement. But if you want, the official position is critical engagement with the North, and we're hoping that in some senses that might be able to restart sometime in the reasonably near future as things start to open up. Where do I want to go? Well, I think in terms of track, I mean, we are not negotiators, and I don't think the European Union is. So even if the European Union has an official meeting, we're not negotiating denuclearization with North Korea. We're telling them that they need to negotiate about a whole range of issues with the United States and South Korea. So we might conceivably be part of a 7-party talks at some stage in the future. But I mean, so we're slightly outside of this process. I think it makes for a different relationship. We're not there hammering our fists on the table saying, until you do X, we're not going to do Y. So in that sense, I mean, I think they're trying to learn from us, trying to appreciate from us. And we're not naive. I mean, they obviously have political objectives, but so do we. One of the reasons I've invested in this was that I thought that the consequences of not having a dialogue with Iraq led to millions of ordinary Iraqis suffering in a very bad way. And whatever I think of, whatever people think of the regime in Pyongyang, if something goes wrong, it's 26 million North Koreans and probably 40 million South Koreans are going to be suffering. So if this goes wrong, so I'm in there as a way, trying to find a way out of the alternative, which is we can see from recent experience is pretty grim. If you look at what's happening in Iraq, you look at what's happening in Libya, look at what's happening in Syria, none of those are great adverts for the ordinary people of those countries benefiting from the consequences of effectively wars, civil wars and external wars.
Absolutely, and we at NCK certainly share that sentiment that we continue to pursue or encourage, greater engagement between the U.S. and North Korea because it matters to the the millions of the North Koreans on the
And it matters to the rest of us, as we've seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, these have knock-on effects. If something goes wrong on the Korean Peninsula, where we won't be suffering as much as the peoples of the two Koreas, but there will be consequences.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Glenn. I want to open it up to the floor, so I'm going to pose a few questions to you from the audience. So if others have questions, please throw them into the Q&A box. The first one we have is from Benjamin Katz of Silberstein, and he asks if he's interested to hear if you've had any conversations with North Koreans about why they may trust certain countries more than others, for example, Sweden. What do they say about that kind of preference? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the answer is track record. I mean, the Swedes have stuck their necks out. They continue to do that. I don't know all the details. You probably need to get Ken Hartstead on here. But I certainly know from my experience that they actually like the fact that we don't cancel our visits. Whatever they've just done, if we've got a scheduled visit, we carry on. And certainly on one occasion, they cancelled a visit. And I told them I thought it was a mistake and they should uncancel it. And they did. So, you know, it's difficult when you need to have a certain self-denying ordinance. Now, we raised the issue of human rights with them. It took us several years, well, it probably took us 4 or 5 years to get the North Koreans to agree to reopen their human rights dialogue with the EU. And then the EU said no. That bit probably didn't help our credibility very much, but we got over that.
Thanks, Glenn. And if I could follow up just briefly to that, I'm curious if the various Track 2 channels in Europe talk to each other.
I mean, we clearly do. I mean, it's, in Europe, probably unlike the United States, it's a comparatively small group. At a European level, I probably know of them if I haven't met almost everyone who's engaged in this process at various times. We don't have a central clearinghouse, but we certainly end up at the same conferences. I mean, as I said, maybe I didn't. I was at the weekend of the conference for the Open Nuclear Network in Vienna, who are looking at ways of ensuring there is no accidental nuclear war. And one of the areas they're looking at, what they're focusing on, is North Korea. And they had a group of people there, and you know, at least amongst the people there, at least 3 European groups who are engaging in Track 2 with North Korea, as well as a couple of American ones.
Thanks, Glenn. We have an anonymous question. They ask, I'm interested in DPRK perspective on Track 2 meetings, particularly with the EU. What's in it for them? Any evidence of malicious use of Track 2 dialogues to drive wedges or to confuse?
Well, I mean, as I said, they said, I mean, we tell them what we see the situation as being like in Europe in terms of relations to themselves, in the United States, and to a degree, but we're not experts on Japan and South Korea. I haven't seen any direct use of our visits in a malicious way. They clearly, I mean, they use our visits internally. We try to tell them we don't want internal publicity, but we tend to be in Rodong Sinmun and we tend to be on the TV when we go. And yes, they're telling the people of North Korea that the fact that they've got high-level visitors, reasonably high-level visitors, coming in is a symbol of people wanting to engage with them. But in a sense, that's right. So yeah, we have to put up with that. I mean, there's, you know, so I mean, if there was a really malicious use of our visit, then I think that would be the one thing that might get us to reconsider whether we were going to go again. But that's not happened. They have pushed the envelope a little bit further than we'd like to go in terms of if you want some of the internal publicity. But that's it.
Great. And we have a question from Jay Brennigan. What concrete benefits, payoffs, or accomplishments can you point to from the Europeans' diplomatic relations with North Korea that are not available to the United States because of our lack of diplomatic recognition?
Well, I mean, firstly, we had for a period of time a human rights dialogue with North Korea. On that basis, some of the very early work suggested that we were starting to get some information before it was suspended. So we've had that. We're able to monitor more effectively the aid that we've given North Korea. The European Union has obviously been reasonably prominent in providing humanitarian aid from the late 90s through till about 2004 or 5. Then there have been periods where we've been providing not food, but we've been providing other forms of assistance in terms of clean water, sanitation, and we've also provided in the past, not at the moment, because the sanctions don't allow us to, but in the past, the European Union has provided North Koreans with tractors and other equipment and expertise on things like double cropping and the rest. So yeah, we've got engaged with the North Koreans, which means that it gives us a degree of influence. I mean, it's not conditional, but yeah, we're able to do those things, and we've certainly helped in the past. I was thanked, along with a lot of others, for helping get 2 American journalists out of North Korea, 2 women who were arrested for allegedly crossing the border. So yes, it does serve some kind of purpose.
I'm going to try, yeah, sorry. I'm going to try and marry these 2 questions together, but we have 2 questions that are about kind of the content of Track 2 dialogues. And one kind of asks from Frederick Barthasot, he asks, isn't the biggest hurdle to normal diplomatic relations between the US and North Korea a historic trauma stemming from the Korean War? And if this is true, how can Track 2 dialogues help overcome this trauma? And then Paul Tia kind of asks a similar question about the limits of just having political discussions as Track 2 themes. So kind of how would it be useful to expand who is participating in these to discuss a variety of topics? And maybe those aren't 2 very related questions, but they were a little bit related in my mind. So I'll pose them to you in that way.
Okay, I mean, firstly, in terms of our Track 2, there is nothing off the limits. We're not told we can't discuss certain things. As I said, we were raising the issue of restarting the human rights dialogue for several years. That's rather off the agenda now because, as I said, the North Koreans agreed to reopen the dialogue and the European Union said no, in that sense. But yes, we talk about human rights, we talk about the economy. I mean, the one thing to talk about is to not just talk about nuclear, if you want, their nuclear program. They may be prepared, and I thought they got very close at Hanoi to be willing to give up over a period of time. This is going to be a process and not a one-off event lasting at least a decade, because you need to build some trust. But they are prepared, in my view, to certainly give up the production of new nuclear materials, probably end testing of nuclear weapons and ICBMs, and probably over a period of time give that up. But it was going to be in exchange for other help. They're interested in the economy. I mean, one of the reasons they've actually for their nuclear program is that they can't compete with South Korea, the United States, and Japan in terms of conventional weapons. They're interested also. The 2 enormous shortages they have in North Korea are energy and labor power. They want, which is why they were so interested in the Singapore Declaration, saying denuclearization of the peninsula. For them, that was code that they will be able to maintain a civil nuclear program, because of course South Korea wasn't going to give up its civil nuclear program. So denuclearization of the peninsula didn't mean abandoning civil nuclear power. Now they need civil nuclear power if they're going to continue an autarkic economy. The limits of hydropower there. Coal mining is increasingly difficult. If you're going to bridge the gap, it's civil nuclear power. So the second thing is that nuclear weapons actually give them the ability to decant 100,000 men, it is men, out of the military into the factories. They have a very old-fashioned view of the economy. You have thousands of people in factories. It might just work. I won't go into all of that. But anyway, their view is if they can get that relief, they can be an Asian tiger and grow their economy at 10% a year. And in 25 years, you could even start thinking seriously about negotiating unification. But before then, forget it. So there is a method in the madness in terms of what's actually going on. But you need to be talking about those things with them and not refusing to talk about anything than nuclear. Giving up nuclear power will be part of a wider deal in which there's going to be economic relief to North Korea, as we saw with the agreed framework. The agreed framework was effectively giving $4.5 billion worth of nuclear power plants to North Korea. Now, allowing for where we are and inflation, you're looking for 15 to 20 billion, probably, as the settlement figure. South Korea will certainly carry 2/3 to 3/4 of that, but the rest has got to be found from somewhere. And frankly, it won't be the United States, because no American president could deliver that through Congress. So it means you're looking at Japan and the European Union.
Speaking of Japan and the European Union, we have a question in the chat about how we'll need cooperation from other countries on all of these issues. And so the question is, do you have any suggestions to better promote cooperation among European countries, South Korea, China, and the US and Japan, to use these dialogues with North Korea to return to negotiations about all these issues?
Well, I mean, the fundamental negotiation, as far as I can see, has to be between Washington and Pyongyang. I mean, there is no solution without Washington being absolutely central with Seoul alongside. We are part players in this process, but I do think we need to be clear that we're willing to be part players and we're willing to actually help lock in the United States. I mean, there's two things that will internationalize the process, one of which is the need to pay, which America can't do for internal political reasons. And the second one is going to be security guarantees. And the North Koreans we're very intrigued by the JCPOA, the Iran deal, because when Bush got in 2002, he tore up the agreed framework. That was it, poof. With the Iran deal, when Trump tried to tear it up, there was a certain degree of resilience and robustness about the deal, because the European Union, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, and China all said, hang on, the Iranians are keeping to this deal, and it didn't die. Maybe dying now, we'll see what happens there. But you're going to need security guarantees, and it will be the UN Security Council Plus that provide those guarantees. So there is a role for us. There is no answer without us, but there is equally, there's no start on that road without Washington. So the sooner we can get people back together, the better. The only problem is that the war on Ukraine is, in a sense, splitting away, if you want, Moscow and Beijing from this process. We need to bring them back, because again, there is no solution without. I mean, there's certainly no solution without Beijing. Moscow is a different situation, but you can't do this deal without Beijing as part of the process.
I guess a follow-up question to that then would be, do you see a role for Europe in trying to improve cooperation, maybe cashing in some of the capital of what they've been able to do on Ukraine in alliance with the US to try and improve prospects for negotiations and cooperation between Beijing and Washington?
Well, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate our importance from this. I mean, we will be rightly completely marginalized once the Washington, Seoul, Beijing, and Pyongyang start engaging seriously in finding a solution, a progressive solution over a period of a decade. I mean, which is quite right. But in the meantime, we're keeping the flame alive. We're making sure that the two sides are not completely ignorant of each other, because there are very few people who can pass on anything about what the North Koreans are thinking as the rest. So, I mean, I will be very happy to be able to look back in 20 years' time and say I played a small part in what led to a solution. I mean, diplomacy fails until it succeeds. I mean, we're used to that in the United Kingdom. The Good Friday Agreement, I mean, the number of ministers who tried to get an agreement on the Irish situation, were endless. We will, if at first you don't succeed, try diplomacy.
I wish that was a little bit more of the mentality here in DC.
Yeah. Well, there is the solution. I mean, part of the problem is that the Biden administration is very distracted. Understandably, this is not a criticism by what else is happening in the world, but what they need to do is to at least have an eye on what's happening in North Korea, because it really isn't going to help if the North Koreans feel forced. I mean, there's two reasons for. I mean, not all testing is provocative. It is provoking, but it's not provocative. They do need to advance their technology, because the Americans haven't stopped advancing their technology. We're talking about new, more sophisticated missile defense systems and the rest. So, but equally, what we don't want is the North Koreans to feel that they have to be provocative in order to get attention in Washington.
Thanks, Glenn. I want to pivot a little bit to talk specifically about your engagement with North Korean diplomats. We have some questions here about your impression, asking about what your impression is of the North Korean diplomats that you've engaged with and the professionals that you've engaged with. Do they have similar backgrounds of knowledge as their Western counterparts? And or do you think that there are things that they do particularly well, or wish that that they could improve their knowledge base on? And then, kind of related but separate to that, if you could comment a little bit about your assessment of DPRK's newly appointed Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee. I know that your main interlocutor is the Workers' Party, but if you could comment a little bit on that professional appointment, we'd be happy to hear insight.
I mean, I think North Korean people in North Korea, in the party, in the ministries, and in the diplomatic service are very well informed. They don't have a shortage of knowledge. The problem is understanding, which is not to be critical. I mean, when we talk to people in Pyongyang, I'm talking about the political people we're in dialogue with, not. They all know what the French local election results were last week. They can quote them to us. They don't necessarily understand what that means. I mean, what that means for them and the future. They will know what the election results were in France on Sunday night, but not necessarily understand the consequences. There is an issue here. Is Macron going to get an absolute majority or not? If he doesn't have an absolute majority, a lot of his European development program may be under threat, because Mélenchon is comparatively Eurosceptic. So Macron's got a plan for developing, if you want, European common foreign and security policy, European defense policy. Now that has implications for North Korea. So they don't necessarily understand. I mean, they do have a version of what the Chinese used to call reference news. Senior Chinese figures used to get twice daily a summary of world news. I mean, and that sort of thing is distributed. But I said, the problem is it's not the information, it's understanding. So that they need training in how to understand. I mean, I had a discussion with the North Korean ambassador in London recently about what was going to happen to Boris Johnson. they try to explain the various possibilities about challenges and what that meant, and the rest is not easy for someone living in a country where that's completely inconceivable.
Yeah, I'm reminded, I think.
Oh, yes. And so you asked about Chase Ennui.
Yes.
The answer is, I mean, she's one of the only, as far as I can tell, one of the only senior pro-engagement people who survived. I mean, in the sense of keeping her job. Riso Young, lost his post. I mean, he was very old. He was certainly well past normal retirement age as head of the international department of the party. Ri Yong Ho lost his position as foreign minister. She was one of the vice foreign ministers. She's recently been appointed as foreign minister herself. We don't quite know what that means. I'm hoping it's good news. I mean, it's not bad news. But certainly in the past, when we had Kang Suk-ju, who I mentioned as the chief negotiator in the six-party talks, he was offered the post of foreign minister some years ago, and he turned it down. He preferred to have the position of first vice foreign minister, because that's where the heavy lifting is done. The foreign minister is the one who flies around the world and sits in not very important meetings. It does a lot of the protocol. Now, of course, there's not much protocol taking place at the moment, and there probably won't be for a while. But nevertheless, in the past, the key engine of foreign policy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, apart from in the party, has been the first vice foreign minister rather than the foreign minister. But maybe in this case it's different. And certainly some of the people I know say it will be different under her. And I'm looking forward to be proved wrong.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, she's also participated in a lot of American-led track twos.
Oh, she has. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, but in a sense, that's now, she won't be in the future. I mean, you don't have foreign ministers. They might meet the track two people, but they're not the ones that are sitting down for, I mean, our typical program is we have a couple of days of meetings. You're not going to get that, I don't think. I mean, that's not a track two, that's something else. If you've got the foreign minister spending 2 days with somebody, that's close to negotiations.
Yeah, I guess I was, suggesting perhaps that her track two experience will help form her more official capacity as.
I think it will, and I think, I mean, one of the reasons we think that, I mean, certainly Riso Young was so engaged with us was he'd been before he was the head of the international department, and vice minister of the Politburo executive. I mean, he'd been foreign minister, and before that, he'd been the ambassador in Switzerland, and he'd been responsible for housing Kim Jong-un when he was at school in Switzerland. So he had a very good connection there.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that. And then we have a flurry of questions. I want to try and get to all of them, and so they might be jumping around a little bit. But Miss Theodora Gubchanova asks if you have been able to compare your personal experience, or I guess her question is, do you know if there's a difference in attitude of North Korean officials to EU Track 2 compared to US-led ones, maybe from your personal experiences with different Track 2 hosts?
Between EU Track 2s and?
US-led Track 2s.
Well, as I said, I think the key thing is that we're not seen as quasi-negotiators. I mean, in terms of, yes, we pass our messages back to people in Europe, but none of those, apart from in an extended sort of six-party talks format, are going to be sat around the table negotiating with the North Koreans. Whereas potentially, I mean, I think with US Track 2, there's always a view that this is feeding into the negotiating process potentially.
Thanks for that insight. And then Frederick Barthasat asks another question: how can Track 2 dialogues be widened to engage bigger parts of civil society or professional politicians in order to multiply the interactions between European stakeholders and North Koreans?
Well,
and what do you think the results of that kind of expansion.
I'm not sure I mean, there's a whole hierarchy of tracks 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, and whatever. I mean, I think people-to-people engagement is very important. We should be trying to, if you want, encourage that, but the drag is as much on the European side as it is elsewhere. I mean, we do have an Erasmus Mundus program where the European Union brings people from abroad to study. I mean, in theory, we could be bringing North Koreans to study in the EU, but frankly, it's not happening. It's very difficult. There's a lot of resistance, and there's also, frankly, the problem that North Koreans don't come in once. They come in pairs. And so applications for university in pairs doesn't really work. But that's the reality. If you want North Koreans, you need 2 of them at a time. So yes, let's do the people-to-people exchanges. But we've had some of that. I mean, but yes, we need to be bringing them here. But at the moment, it's only impossible in Europe. It's much more difficult in the United States. We still have this ridiculous rule that I have to apply for an American visa because I visited North Korea. I mean, how does it make sense in trying to learn about what's going on? Any European who's been to North Korea can't come to the United States without a visa. And if you put in a request for a visa at the moment in Europe, they will give you an appointment in February next year. So yeah. February 2023. So if I didn't happen to already have my visa, I would have to wait for February 2023 before I could even meet an official to apply for one.
Yeah, I think that's an unfortunate policy that was developed, and
also, I mean, it wouldn't be so bad as a policy. If I could get an interview next week, fine. 8 months?
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that was a mistaken policy.
That's effectively a travel ban. That's not a visa policy. That's a travel ban.
Well, Glenn, I'd like to ask you one final question from our audience. And I know you've mentioned that there have been requests for meetings with European officials. And so one of our audience members was asking just a little bit more insight about what is it that North Koreans want to talk about right now, and kind of what do you think the interest is at the moment for approaching European officials?
I mean, the approaches, the 2 approaches that I'm aware of, and certainly people do other things without me, so but I'm aware of an approach to have a discussion about human rights. Now, I suspect I know what it was about. It was about trying to persuade the European Union not to sponsor a human rights resolution in Geneva. But I'm in favor of a discussion. I'm not in favor necessarily of not sponsoring that resolution, but North Koreans are offering to talk to us. So yes, and they wanted to restart the political dialogue, which is in parallel with the human rights dialogue, where you have general political discussions. They wanted to start it at Director General level, which is, well, which we haven't had since 2016. They clearly have some messages they want to pass on to us, probably for the Americans. I mean, the Europeans are very nervous that they don't want to get out of step with Washington. And Washington prefers to play it safe and for us to not get out of step with them by not having the dialogue. I think that's a mistake on both sides. I think that's a mistake by Washington, constantly complaining they've got no idea what North Koreans want, but effectively not encouraging people they're willing to talk to them. And I think it's a mistake by the Europeans that if you are going to be in any way a global power, you can decide whether you want your own dialogue and not depend on what Washington thinks. And if Washington doesn't quite like it, fine, but they might find they benefited from it.
Thanks, Glenn. We're almost at time, so I just want to thank you so much for joining us. But I did want to give you just a minute to, if you had any final thoughts you'd like to share to the group, would love to get any closing thoughts you have, and then we'll close out the program.
Well, I mean, I guess the answer is, I guess I'm talking predominantly to an American community of those people engaged and interested in North Korea. We are not the answer, but we're we're part of the solution, and engage Europeans when necessary. Remember, we're there. We can have access that you don't have. We can have information you don't have. You're the guys who are going to solve this in the end, but if we can make a contribution, don't neglect us.
Well, Glenn, thanks for sharing so much of your insight and this very apt reminder to turn to Europe for some advice and bridge building, if I may. Thanks so much to our audience for joining us, and to Ross Tokola and the East-West Center for partnering with us on this program where we're examining European relations with North Korea. And my effusive thanks to Glenn for joining us today again. I think I've thanked you repeatedly today, but just a final thanks for joining us. And I hope that you have a wonderful evening. And thanks for everybody for tuning in. Have a good day.
Thank you.